Yeah.
Oh, well, I don't know. I'm just I'm just trying to get a clear idea of the distinctions between Hendriksen's view of this progressive parallelism and other views such as yours.
Okay.
You say they have it's 7 stories or one story with 7 parts, and you say no, it's just one story with 1 part.
Actually, they say it's Hendriksen would say, and amillennialists in general would say, on the progressive parallelism view, they would say that it's one story told 7 times. So it doesn't have
Repeating.
repeating. It doesn't have 7 parts. The Revelation has 7 parts, but those are the same. But the story itself that the Revelation is telling is, one story, and it's told 7 times. And whereas, and so that would be what would be called a cyclical view or a parallel view, where the sections are repeating the same content, maybe with additional detail. And I mean, there's some differences, but they're not. Basically, the 7 literary sections of the Revelation would be chronologically parallel, would be chronologically covering the same time. That would be a progressive parallelism view. And the key to that view, as far as I understand it, the key is the identification of the final judgment. And when I say final judgment, what they mean by it and what I mean by it is the judgment that immediately follows the second coming. So there's the second coming, the resurrection, and then the final judgment. And on the chart or on the table in the column final judgment, the amillennialist or the person who holds to progressive parallelism, there are some amillennialists that don't follow this, so it's not entirely one-to-one correspondence, but people that follow progressive parallelism believe that those passages portray the final judgment at the end of history, and that the things that precede those are the one story that's told 7 times. And so that would be the progressive parallelism view. Hendriksen has done the most important work on that view, and these are his passages that he selects, but some other progressive parallelism systems have slightly different passages, but the thought is exactly the same. So same story told 7 times.
Same story 7 times, okay.
And on the simplest the simplest view that would be close to mine is that these are not all the final judgment. Chapter 20 is the final judgment, but chapter 6 is not. Chapter 11 is not. Chapter 14 is not. And so these are not the final judgments, except for chapter 20, with the possible exception of 19, but I'm just saying that because I don't have it in my head right now. But so if there's only one final judgment and not the same final judgment repeated over and over again, then that changes the structure of the revelation. That means that these other things precede, if they are actual judgments in history, then they precede the final judgment, right? They precede the final judgment.
You think?
Yeah, I'm on board with that.
Yeah.
These so-called final judgments on this chart are using the word final differently than some other people are using.
Right. They're using the word final judgment. I mean, they're using the phrase final judgment in the classically understood sense of it's the judgment after Christ returns. That's what they mean. That's what Hendriksen means. That's what a progressive parallelism means. And so when we read the sixth seal being opened and there was an earthquake and the stars fell, that's the final judgment after Christ returns. That's the way that
After Christ returns.
Right.
That's the distinction I didn't get before.
I didn't either.
Oh, sorry about that.
Okay.
Yeah, I think I have to think through things more clearly. So, okay, good. So I'm glad that was helpful. I think, Shirley, did you have something to say?
Well, I could have said a lot, but I've been quiet and listening more in life,
Of course.
more today. But anyway, I guess with me, I believe it's chronological.
Mhm.
The reason I say that is because I believe God is God of order.
Mhm.
And even when we look at the other books of the Bible, to include Genesis, he didn't start telling us about the creation of man before the beginning was God, and before the earth was void, and before he spoke about light, etc. He told it in chronological order. And I think the whole Bible, when the same God that inspired the one to write Genesis, is the same one that inspired John to write Revelation. And I believe in his inspiration to these apostles. He did it in chronological order. He didn't do one in order, one in another one, and well, this will happen, and the way John wrote it, it was in chronological order. It's just like the one who wrote Genesis is in chronological order. And God is a God of order. He's not a God of unorder,
Amen.
And so I really think it's all in chronological order. And as far as the judgments, I like you. We have a final judgment in the end, in chapter 20 to 22, where it talks about the great white throne judgment and the book of life. And that's something we have to understand too. Christians are not going to be at the great white throne judgment. That's for the lost, but Christians are going to be judged from the book of life, and their names to be written, of course. And then we're going to be judged based on what we did for God here on earth and how we carried out or didn't carry out his purposes, and we're going to be rewarded accordingly. But only the ones who are lost will get the great white throne judgment.
Thanks,
Well, the
Shirley.
only thing about that is Genesis. You read Genesis chapters 1 and 2, and maybe 3. I can't remember where it is.
2.
We have those are chronological.
Right. So chapter 2 is focusing in on something that happened in chapter 1. So it's it's a literary device of introducing.
So
something.
now,
Yeah.
can I ask you a question?
No.
So now, Shirley, are you saying then that even though we're already in heaven, that we're going to be judged again?
No, I'm saying our rewards are going to be based on what we've done for God here on earth. Because there are 5 crowns we could get: crown of righteousness, crown of soul winning. I can't remember them all, but there's 5 crowns, and we're going to be rewarded based on what we've done for God here on earth.
That's correct. Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not endorsing, because I don't know everything in.
Well, we all don't know.
Particular thing, but
these are the things I have been taught throughout my Christian walk in the churches and preachings and teachings I've been under, even under the book of Revelations, etc., preachings and so forth, and other teachings.
Yeah, no, I wasn't implying there was anything wrong with it. I was just admitting my ignorance of the entire content.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So, no, I agree that the Bible does teach that believers will be rewarded for their obedience, for their works, for the level of sanctification, and how they express their love for Christ by loving their neighbor. And that we are not judged for salvation, but it is still a judgment, where a judgment is being rendered, a verdict is being given, a reward is being given. So that type of thing. But I think the main difference between, and I'm glad that we were able to talk about it, the main difference between a progressively parallel system and the other main option being a strictly chronological system is that on the strictly chronological system, the visions of judgment that you encounter before chapter 20 are either, this is what happens, okay, there's only two options what you can do with them. They're either judgments that happen in history prior to the second coming, or they are an example of prolepsis, which I mentioned earlier, which was a literary device that kind of gives a flash forward to the final judgment. And so it's there as a reminder in the text. And some people take that view. In fact, that view is pretty popular even among dispensationalists. So, dispensationalists, premillennialists will take that view. And amillennialists will take that view as well. So there are people in every eschatological camp that, even though a particular camp might have a particular structure of the book of Revelation that most of their people in that camp adhere to, there are postmillennialists who think that the book of Revelation is laid out progressive parallelism, although the most common thing for a postmillennialist to be is to have a strict chronological layout of the book. So that's just an example. That's true of all of the various views. So the person's, whether they say I'm progressively parallel or I'm chronological in my understanding of the structure, it doesn't actually tell you what interpretive camp they belong to. It just tells you how they understand the book of Revelation. To make it more complicated, I know we all enjoy the more complicated. So
what events, Chuck, would they be saying happened? Like World War I, World War II, that type of thing?
So let me get to the more complicating thing first. So the more complicating thing is in the partial preterist or the preterist camp. So the preterist is somebody who believes that most of everything except for the consummation visions have been fulfilled already.
Excuse me, Chuck.
Yeah.
My wife needs me to help her unload the car now. So at 1:30. So I can go back and listen to what you're going to say from here on later.
Okay. All right. So let me see what time is it? So, yeah. Okay.
So we're in 1 minute or 1 hour, 38 minutes in, so I'll know where to pick up.
Oh, I did a second video, so I'll find it and let you know. I'll just look for the place where Dawn isn't, and then I'll tell you.
Oh, okay. Oh, that's right. Okay. All right. Thank you all.
All right. See you later.
All right. Bye.
So
Okay.
a preterist believes that all has been filled except for the second coming.
Yeah, and everything
Right,
that's
okay.
and the attendant events with the second coming, right? The resurrection of the dead, the final judgment, heaven and hell, that kind of stuff.
Okay.
So, and everybody thinks that's in our future. There's no debate about that. It's about the stuff before that. That's where the debate is. So then the preterist. So there are two types of preterist views. One is that the entire book of Revelation is about the fall of Jerusalem, and on that view, what you have is chapters 1 through 11 present you the fall of Jerusalem, and then chapter 12 is a transitional chapter. It actually goes back to Genesis and is giving you some backstory. And then chapter 13 with the beast coming out of the sea, that this is also telling you about the fall of Jerusalem, but Jerusalem has already fallen in chapter 11. And so now this is going back. So it's a recapitulation. So the second half of the book basically fills in more information from the first half. So that's one view. Another view is that chapters 1 through 11 are about the fall of Jerusalem, and chapters 13 through 19 or 13 through 18 are about the fall of Rome, which is called Babylon in the Revelation. Okay, and so then those two sections are chronological, right? They're sequential. Mm-hmm. Jerusalem falls before Rome falls historically. Right. So then so you have a strict chronology on one view, right? That goes Jerusalem and then Rome, and then you have another view which it's kind of parallelism, except it's big sections. It's like chapter 1 through 11 is progressively parallel with chapters 13 through 18. So And then premillennialists have a different structure and dispensationalists have a different structure, but both of those generally follow a chronological, as Shirley said, kind of just straight through, because God's a God of order, although they would recognize that in chapter 12, this is a backstory. It talks about, the ancient serpent who tempted Eve and all of that. And so it's going back and referring to, it's giving you backstory. Why is the serpent, why is the dragon trying to persecute the church? That's chapter 12 answers that question, because of the ancient the fall and the curse on the serpent and the enmity between the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent. This is why persecution is happening. So chapter 12 is explanatory, not strictly chronological. Yeah. So, yeah, and then your question about what events do people see as being fulfilled if it's not the fall of Jerusalem, the fall of Rome, that would be preterist. If you were a historicist, you would say that World War I and World War II were predicted in the Revelation. You would say the French Revolution was predicted in the Revelation. The rise of the papacy was predicted in the Revelation. And we kind of wrinkle our eyebrows and crunch up our face when we think about it and go, what? Why would people believe that? Every single reformer believed that. Every single reformer was a historicist. The Puritans were historicists. They read the Bible that way. Charles Spurgeon read the Bible that way. The historicism was really popular until the middle of the 19th century. There are very few historicist interpreters around still. But
Charles Spurgeon believed that, huh?
Charles Spurgeon, Matthew Henry. Yeah. They were all historicists.
Altogether.
So Jonathan Edwards, a lot of great people that we look back on and we say, thank God for this person. They were historicists in their understanding. So it's not to be dismissed so easily. We can't just scoff at it. And
no, you got to understand.
Yeah. And so, eschatological views are kind of in flux, right? They change over time, and new systems arise, and old systems that were popular disappear from the scene. Historicism, like I said, is nearly gone. I think the last historicist commentary, at least the one I'm aware of, was published in 1990. I have a copy of it. It's actually really good. But as far as I'm concerned, when they start talking about, this passage predicts the rise of Islam, this passage predicts the French Revolution, I think they're not correct. But he has a lot of things that are helpful to say. So yeah, historicists might say World War I, World War II. A dispensationalist will take, as the visions of the Revelation and put them into a time period in our future after the church has been raptured, which typically in dispensationalism, they see the call of God to John in chapter 4 to come up into heaven. I saw a door open in heaven and I heard a voice saying, come up here. And they see that as a picture of the rapture. And I find that interesting on their hermeneutic, because on their hermeneutic, it's, a literal hermeneutic. And actually what literally happened there was John saw in a vision a door open and he heard a voice and he was transported into heaven. And there's nothing there about the church being raptured, and there's nothing there about John representing the church. And there's on a dispensational hermeneutic, it's nearly impossible to get to their understanding. But so I find that to be a bit inconsistent. But they would say all of the visions of judgment are about things after the rapture. Historic premillennialists would put all of the events, all of the judgments, visions of judgment after chapter 6 and following, in the period immediately preceding the return of Christ, which precedes the 1,000-year millennium. And they do that, it's a chronological scheme, right? Because they see the return of Christ in chapter 19. And so all of the visions from chapter 6 to 19 about judgment are about things that happen immediately before, the time of trouble, the tribulation which precedes the second coming of Christ. And so, on their view, on a historic premill view, the rapture there's no two comings, no two-stage coming of Christ. Christ comes once after the tribulation. So, and that's the historic view of the church. The other view, Darby's view, is new. So anyway, to answer your question, and that's a really important question, what events are these predicting? Every system, of course, as you would imagine, answers them differently, right? And that's because the way the system is. And so in one sense, it's not, the important thing isn't being able to put these things on a timeline. The only reason that it might be important has to do with the dating of the book, right? So most of the systems that I mentioned believe that the book of Revelation was written after the fall of Jerusalem. Therefore, it can't be about the fall of Jerusalem. But I have examined, I did my master's thesis on 110 pages on the arguments in favor of a late date, 95, 96 AD, 21 different arguments. I surveyed, my bibliography's got like over 100 books in it. I did a lot of reading, surveyed a lot of stuff, and I couldn't find one argument that held water. And in fact, that was even persuasive or compelling. And in fact, I could find several arguments that were solid, as far as I could tell, for an early date. And so if you opt for an early date, which many people in the church do today and have, there's always been a group of Christians, a large group of Christians in church history who believe the book of Revelation was written before the fall of Jerusalem. If that's the conclusion you come to on examining the date, then the option there is that this is about the fall of Jerusalem, or at least part of this is about the fall of Jerusalem. And then when you start comparing the Old Testament about the fall of Jerusalem in the Old Testament and Jesus' sayings about the fall of Jerusalem in the New Testament to what the Revelation is saying, and then you go, well, it does really appear that they're talking about the same thing. So then you arrive at a preterist or partial preterist viewpoint, where the judgment scenes are have something to do with the covenant curses, the fall of Jerusalem, etc. And so, but that's contingent on the dating. If someone's convinced that it was dated afterwards, then the preterist scheme is ruled out already. Can't possibly be. Although I do have some commentators who believe in a late date, like 95 AD, and who still think it's about the fall of Jerusalem because they think John was writing and about the fall of Jerusalem 30 years after it happened. It's like, oh, come on. But that doesn't make any sense at all to me. But I am one of the things about the dating question that, when people contradict themselves, we lose confidence in them, and we lose confidence in what they say. And so when somebody says something like Greg Beale, well-known, and respected, and he has a lot of great things that he's said and contributed, and so I wouldn't discount his work in general, but on the question of the dating of the Revelation, he says that after examining all 21 arguments for the late date, and he believes in the late date himself, he examines all 21 arguments, same arguments that I examined in my paper, and he said he was not convinced by any of those arguments. 20 of them actually, there's one he was convinced by. 20 of them, he says, the evidence for these is not strong at all. These arguments, they're not convincing, they're not helpful. He says, but the Revelation was written after the fall of Jerusalem, and he said, I know it because he says there's one piece of evidence that is compelling. He says the piece of evidence is that the idea of Babylon, Babylon the Great, being used as a metaphor for Rome. He said that's what has to be proved. He said if that is what's happening in Revelation, that Babylon the Great is being used for Rome, then the preterist position is established. He says, but we have no historical evidence, no literary evidence that Babylon the Great was used as a metaphor for Rome until after the fall of Jerusalem. And then he quotes the Sibylline oracles and some other early writings from the 1st century, right, where Babylon the Great is being used. And I thought, well, that's absurd. If you look at 1 Peter 5:13, Peter writes, "She who is in Babylon, chosen together with you, sends her greetings, and so does my son Mark. Greet one another with a kiss of love." When he says she who is in Babylon, he means the church, that's the she, the church at the location where Peter is, which he is calling Babylon. But we know that Peter is not in Babylon. We know that Babylon as a nation has fallen a long time ago. We actually know that Peter, we don't know with absolute certainty, but I would say that historically better than 90% of all the commentators on this passage have said Peter is in Rome. And the position of most commentators today is that Peter was in Rome. But when was Peter executed? Peter was executed, if I'm getting my dates right, I think he was executed before Paul, but maybe not. Surely you would know. It's like 64 or 68 that Peter was executed.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah. It was before 70 AD. Before 70 AD. Peter is executed by Nero. Nero dies in 68. So Peter is executed between 64 and 68 before 70 AD. He is clearly using Babylon as a metaphor for Rome. Clearly. So Beale's greatest argument, he said all these other arguments are worthless, but this is the best one. so you go to the best one and you go, well, how could you?
What was interesting about Peter was he was crucified upside down.
Yeah, he said he wasn't worthy to be crucified the same way that his Lord was. And
right. And that just struck me so, when I saw that, I thought, wow, it just gave me a big wow.
Yeah. What devotion, right? Fantastic.
Would you repeat what you said when you said she who is in Babylon? What did you say about that?
She is the church.
The church.
The church.
He's personifying the church as a woman, which is not uncommon. And he's already got a literary device there, right? A personification of the church as a woman. And he's saying that she's in Babylon, but the church is not in Babylon. The church is in Rome, but he's using the word Babylon because Babylon is the instrument of God's judgment in the Old Testament upon the apostate Jews, right?
Gotcha.
And guess what happens? And this is why Beale says nobody could have called Rome Babylon until after the fall of Jerusalem, because there would have been no reason to call it Babylon because God had not used them yet to judge the Jews.
And here Peter
but it was clear that Rome was subjugating the Jews, and that Daniel had prophesied that the fourth empire, the Roman Empire, the beast of the fourth empire, would be that during that period, two things would happen. The Messiah would be executed and the temple would be destroyed. So it's totally obvious to anybody who knew their Bible that Rome was the new Babylon. So Beale, the thing that Beale must do to make the statement that he did is either he must argue that Peter was not in Rome, which he could be right, but he would have 98% of the scholarship against him, or he'd have to argue that Peter did not die in the under Nero, which would be unheard of to argue that. So it would just be so what you're then left with is that Beale has forgotten Beale, who's a great scholar, has selectively eliminated this passage. Or the third option would be, and this might be likely, although I don't want to say for sure that this is Beale's view, but some New Testament scholars don't believe Peter wrote Peter. So right. So
oh really?
Yeah, and so I think that's my personal understanding or my personal view of that is that that's a ridiculous, it comes really close to denying inspiration type of view, but there are some scholars who don't believe that Peter wrote Peter, or Peter didn't write Second Peter, and Paul didn't write all 13 of those letters. He only wrote 6 of them, you know, and stuff like that. And they argue it based on several things, but one of the keys to their arguments is that something called pseudonymity, you know, writing under a false name, that was acceptable practice in the first century, and that it wouldn't have been any big deal if somebody had done that. But actually, it would have been, although there were authors who wrote under a pen name, that it would have been inconceivable for the church to have received a letter purportedly from Peter that didn't come from Peter, right?
Yeah.
And they would have had to receive it. They would have had to receive it after his death, right? Because if Peter was still alive, he would say, "I didn't write that," right?
John did that one.
It just is. It's unbelievable. And then the argument for inspiration often relies on, like, people say, well, how come the early church accepted these books as inspired? And usually the answer is something like this. I'm not saying this is the answer. I believe it's the whole story, but the answer usually is that book was written by an apostle or by a known associate of an apostle. So like Luke was a known associate of Paul, and so it comes with Paul's endorsement. And you know,
Well,
and
speaking
Mark.
of Peter,
Yeah, go ahead.
speaking of Peter and Rome, I believe it to be Rome too, because I was in Rome. I visited Rome, and even the Vatican is titled St. Peter's, what is it, Basilica or something like
Basilica.
that.
Basilica.
And it's believed that Peter was the one that constructed that church. And his tomb is just right below a high altar at that church. We saw that, and then the Vatican, it's gorgeous. I mean, I really enjoyed that. But that's why I think it's Rome and not Babylon. You know, in the book of Peter we just read.
Sure. So if that's so assuming, which I think, you know, pretty much is the natural assumption, assuming that is Rome, then Peter is calling Rome Babylon. And then that leads, of course, that lends some credence to John calling Rome Babylon, right? Or the identification of Babylon the Great with Rome in Revelation. And there's even a question. So you could also make the case has been made, and not just me thinking about it, but actually I've read where there's a question always that's addressed in biblical studies about dependence, literary dependence. So this is not a denial of inspiration, but I just a second, Shirley, I'll let you say something in a sec. But it is important to know, or helpful to know, which New Testament letters were written in what order. You know, what was the order, and how did this letter influence, or is it referred to? Let's say it like that. Is it referred to in later letters? So James, for instance, refers to statements of Jesus, but his way of referring to them shows that he's not referring to an actual gospel, a written thing. He's actually referring to verbal statements of Jesus that he himself heard, because he's not using the exact literary form of gospels when he refers to it. So anyway, so the question is, what came first, First Peter or the Revelation? And some people would argue that the Revelation precedes First Peter, and that's why Peter can call Babylon Rome, because John has already done it. So it's an interesting question, and you can see how that might be a helpful thing. Go ahead, Shirley.
Well, did you know too, though, that the first cathedral of Rome was not St. Peter's, how you say that, Basilica or whatever, but it was actually St. John's Cathedral, and it was believed to be the first Catholic church of the Western world.
Wow.
Yeah, they told us that when we were over there, and we got to see that too. But so that kind of goes along with what you say too, where John, when in his writing, is actually speaking of Rome when he speaks of the Babylon. You know.
Right, exactly. Wow, thanks for that. I'll do some research on that.
I thought Peter was the first pope in the Catholic Church, isn't he?
In the Catholic Church, right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Peter is
Too,
called the
yeah.
first pope, and pope just means
First
father.
Pope, yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Pope just means father.
Mm.
And you know, I don't, Protestants, of course, don't believe that they believe Peter was a church father, obviously,
Right. Right.
but that
Oh, not a pope.
he wasn't the pope in the modern sense of the word pope.
Right.
He was a church leader, and the modern papacy didn't come into existence until probably the 4th or 5th century.
Mm.
And then the modern pope, as the leader of Christendom, quote unquote, didn't occur until the 10th century or the 11th century, when there was the split which formed
Oh,
the Eastern
really?
Orthodox Church. And that split occurred, this is interesting, there were 5 centers of Christianity, you know, and each of them had a father, what we might call a bishop over them, but their title was Pope. So you had, you know, Pope so-and-so in Rome, and you had Pope so-and-so in Jerusalem, and Pope so-and-so in Constantinople, and there were 2 other places. So there were 5 places like that they had, and they weren't rivals. They were regional church leaders of the one true church, and Christ was the head of the one true church. And the Pope at Rome had by this time developed obtained much political and military power, and he was also, you know, so he was very influential, and he got it in his head at this particular time, 11th century, that all the other popes should be subordinate to him.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah. It's kind of like
Oh,
it's kind of like
interesting.
you got 5 elders in your church, and then one guy says, "I'm the head elder, and you're all junior elders," right? And some of the junior elders would go, "Okay, yeah, you're smarter than me. You've been doing this longer. I'll be your, you know, I'll sit under you." And the others would go, "What are you talking about? You know, we are equal before God. God appointed each of us to this position, and we are all brothers." Anyway, so that forms a split in the church when the Pope says, "I'm the head guy, and you guys are subordinate." And so the church splits. Eastern Orthodox, the Eastern Church, Eastern areas, they go with the Eastern Church, and what they have over there is the Holy Father, which is Pope, over there in the Eastern Orthodox Church. And the Western Church, the other 2 areas said, "Yes, okay, we'll let you be head over us." And so then now the Roman pontiff, as the head of what we would call the Christian church, usually when we say the Christian church, we don't think of the Eastern Orthodox, even though they're Christian. But in the Western world, the Pope became, at that point, the head of the church,
Oh, how
the visible head of the church. But so when somebody says Peter was the first Pope, Peter in no way was a Pope in the modern sense. No way. He was more like a bishop. He would have been a leader of a local body and an apostle, but he wouldn't have had, aside from his apostleship, his leading of a church or an area wouldn't have been any different than one of the bishops over what we came to call bishops in the 2nd century and stuff like that. So yeah, Peter may have been a church father in Rome. If that's what you mean by Pope, church father, then I'll grant that he was a Pope. But you know, but he's not a Pope in the sense of over the worldwide church.
Heck, did you ever say when you thought Revelation was written?
Yeah, I did. I think Revelation was written probably around 64, but at least between 64 and 68.
Okay.
Um,
Before the fall of Jerusalem.
oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely. I think there's some
Okay.
good arguments for that, which are not, you know, John basically tells you when he wrote it in it's either chapter 13 or 17. I think it's 17 when he says, he's talking about Roman rulers, and he says, 5 have fallen, 1 is. And you go back and you count your Roman rulers, and you start with Caesar Augustus, and you count to number 6, who would be the 1 is, and that's Nero. And Nero reigned from 64 to 68. So that seems pretty easy. And then the number 666, 666, gematria, letters and numbers, is something that we see in the Bible. It's something that was in the culture, and there's only one name that word comes up to, and that's Nero Caesar. If it's written, in Hebrew letters, if it's written in Latin letters, the only one name that it comes up to is Neron Kaiser, which is Nero Caesar. So, so it's, so for those aren't the only reasons. Obviously, there would be other ones, but I think I think those are, both of those, for however strong you might think they are, they're way stronger than any argument for a late date.
Okay.
Usually the argument for the late date goes like this. All the early church believed that the book of Revelation was written after 70 AD. And then they quote, or they cite, they usually list a bunch of names from the early church period, maybe 10 names of church writers. But studies have been done that have shown that all of those people are dependent on Irenaeus. Irenaeus wrote that he wrote a statement where it looks like it's possible that he meant that John wrote the Revelation in Domitian's period, which would have been about 95, 96. And anyway, it's the people who are being cited as saying that that the Revelation was written after the fall of Jerusalem. When you go look at their sources, when you look at their quotes, they're all referencing Irenaeus. They didn't do any independent study. They just are quoting Irenaeus. It's really not fair to say, one guy says one thing and then 50 people quote him. Does that mean 51 people said that? No, one guy said that. He studied it.
He
So, yeah, so that's not really fair. And then you look at Irenaeus' statement, and his statement is, everybody agrees, no matter what you think on the date question, people who examine Irenaeus' statement believe that it's ambiguous and you can't actually tell what he's saying there about the date of Revelation, that he could be saying early or late. And so it's, and we can, I think we did a class about that. I can send the video link out if you're interested in it. But
I would like to.
Yeah. So
Well,
Irenaeus is,
John talked about it.
Yeah. So I'm sorry, I missed what you said.
I would think, in my little puny brain, I would think that if the fall of Jerusalem had taken place already, John would have spoken about it. And maybe some of the things in Revelation wouldn't have needed to be written.
Well, yeah, that's, arguments from silence like that are hard to, you can't use them to actually prove anything, but it seems somewhat reasonable, but I wouldn't put a whole lot of weight on that. I mean, it really depends on what the purpose of a book is, what things do you refer to? So.
Right.
Yeah. So.
I've got to go get beautiful. I'm going to go get my hair cut.
What? More beautiful than right now? Are you kidding me?
Oh boy. Thank you,
Well,
Chuck.
I think I got to go too. I got to go to the post office and a few other things. So
thank you for spending time with us. This is fabulous.
Yeah, thanks for hanging on, and you too, Shirley. Thank you for your contribution.
Sure.
And
Sure.
pretty much any time, if I have the time and people want to talk after the class, I'm totally available.
Yeah, I love it. Love it.
Well, sometimes that might be better because, you don't want to interrupt because of other people wanting to talk and say things. And some of the others, they don't stay for this to talk about it. So, that's another reason why I've been quieter than usual. I could have said a lot more than what I did, but I'll just be quiet and let them talk. Otherwise, so.
Well, I take it from that I didn't say anything that was so objectionable that you felt like you had to say something. So. Oh,
well, maybe I should always keep quiet, huh? Is that what you're trying to tell me?
No,
I become a mouse, right?
Have a great weekend before you two get into it.
So all comments are welcome and encouraged. So, yeah. Which is why one of the reasons, you know, it takes a long time to go through, but I think we get more out of it that way.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I wish some of the others who are quieter would open up too at times. You know, there's some of them just won't say nothing.
I think
And I
what you,
wish sometimes they would say, because I'm sure they could share something.
I think what you got to do is, you know, send them a text or something and say, ask him this, say this.
Well, I'm so afraid I'll say something so stupid that people wonder, what the heck planet is she on?
Oh, don't
No,
ever worry.
There's nothing stupid.
Yeah, well, there are some stupid things, but I've said them. So.
Well, no stupid questions, so I guess it's all right. There's no stupid questions.
Oh,
Yeah.
crud.
We all have been there at some time or another where we're still there because we don't know everything.
Yeah.
Bye, Chuck. Bye,
All right,
Shirley.
Patsy.
I'm going to go get pretty.
So we'll end this now. So thanks for joining.
All righty.
I'll
Okay, we'll see you Tuesday.
All righty. God bless you. Bye-bye.
Uh-huh. Bye.